The auction yard smelled of dust, horses, and sweat, the kind of smell that clung to the back of the throat and left a man thirsty no matter how much water he drank. The sun beat down mercilessly on the small town square, washing everything in harsh light that left no place for shadows. Wagons had been drawn up in a half-circle, merchants and townsfolk standing on tiptoe to get a view of what promised to be more spectacle than business. Children darted between legs, while women fanned themselves with bonnets or scraps of paper. Men leaned against fence posts with whiskey bottles half hidden in their hands, the day's entertainment unfolding in front of them. But for the widow at the center of it all, there was no entertainment. Only terror. Her dress had once been black, worn to her husband's burial the winter before, but now it had faded to a thin gray, threadbare and patched at the elbows. She clutched her little boy close to her chest, his dark curls sticking to his forehead, his thumb pressed into his mouth in confusion more than comfort. Her own face was pale beneath the sun, streaked with dust and dried tears, her eyes wide with the knowledge of what was about to happen. The sheriff stood tall on the platform, papers in his hand, his voice flat as he read. By order of the court, the debts owed by the estate of Mrs. Eliza Turner shall be settled today. Properties and holdings are here listed for claim. He rattled off the cabin she and her husband had shared, a mule that had once been their only help in the field, a plow broken in 2 places. The widow's chin trembled as each item was spoken, each piece of her life parceled into numbers she did not have. And then, almost casually, as though it were nothing more than another ledger entry, the sheriff's voice carried out, custody of minor child, male, age 3, to be determined in the best interests of the town. A gasp rolled through the crowd. The boy whimpered, sensing the fear that rippled through his mother's body. She held him tighter, her arms a shield no law could break. Her voice cracked into the heavy air. No, please, don't take my child away. He's all I have. He's mine. She stumbled forward, nearly falling to her knees, the boy clinging to her neck as she cried out. Her hands trembled, her bonnet sliding off her head as she begged, her words spilling out in a torrent. I'll work, I'll scrub floors, I'll clean your houses. Don't do this. Please, I beg you, don't take him. Some of the women in the crowd looked down, unable to meet her eyes. Others whispered, shaking their heads, pity mixed with relief that it wasn't them up there on display. A few men chuckled under their breath, muttering about how debt was debt, and a burden was a burden, no matter how much one begged. The sheriff didn't flinch, he'd heard it all before. His hand reached down, slow and deliberate, toward the child. The widow backed away, stumbling, holding her boy tighter until he cried out from the strength of her grip. No, you can't, please, don't take him from me. Her voice cracked on the last words, raw and jagged. And then the crowd shifted. At the far edge of the yard, leaning against a fence post as though the whole world had nothing to do with him, a tall figure straightened. He had been there since the start, hat pulled low, arms crossed, watching without a word. His horse was tethered nearby, its reins loose, its head bent to the dirt. The man's shirt was worn but clean, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sunburnt forearms marked with years of work. A silence followed him wherever he went, not because he was feared, though some feared him, but because when he spoke, the weight of it settled in a man's bones. Jacob Carver, the silent rancher. The whispers started low, rippling. Through the crowd, Carver's movin', what's he want with this? He don't speak unless he means to. He stepped forward, each footfall slow and measured, crunching the dry dirt underfoot. The crowd parted instinctively, as though the air itself made way for him. He walked straight toward the platform, his shoulders square, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's outstretched hand. The widow froze, her sobs quieting for the briefest moment as she looked up. Her tear-swollen eyes met the silhouette of the man coming toward her, his face still hidden under the brim of his hat. The boy buried his face against her neck, small arms tightening around her. Jacob stopped at the base of the platform. He said nothing at first. He simply looked, his gaze steady, his presence heavy. The sheriff's hand hovered in the air, caught between authority and hesitation. The silence grew unbearable, the crowd shifting uneasily, until finally Jacob lifted his head, eyes glinting sharp in the sunlight. Enough. The word was spoken low, quiet enough that it might have been missed if not for the weight behind it. It cut through the air sharper than a gunshot. Conversation stopped. A horse snorted. Somewhere, a child hushed mid-whimper. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He did not like being challenged, least of all in front of a crowd. But Jacob Carver was no ordinary man. His silence had made him something larger than himself, an enigma, a figure of respect, even fear. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. "This is lawful claim, Carver. You'd do well not to interfere." But Jacob didn't move, he didn't flinch. His eyes, steel gray, flickered once to the widow, broken, begging, trembling, and then back to the sheriff. His voice came again, low, gravelly, steady as the earth. The silence after Jacob Carver's words was heavier than the desert heat, pressing down on every man and woman gathered. The widow clutched her boy tighter, almost afraid to breathe, while the sheriff's face darkened. It wasn't often someone stood up to the law in front of the whole town, and it was rarer still for that someone to be Jacob Carver, a man who spoke so little that when he did, folks remembered it for years after. The sheriff cleared his throat, the papers in his hand trembling slightly. "Carver, you don't have claim here. You don't have standing. This is town matter. You step back, now." But Jacob didn't step back. He moved forward instead, slow and steady, until he stood almost nose to nose with the sheriff. The brim of his hat shadowed his eyes, but the set of his jaw was clear enough. He raised one hand, not in threat, not in violence, but simply extended it toward the widow. "Give her the boy back." The crowd gasped. A few men muttered under their breath, shifting uneasily. One older rancher near the front crossed his arms, whispering, "He's askin' for trouble." But no one moved. The widow's knees nearly gave way. She had begged until her voice was raw, and still she hadn't been heard. Yet now this man, this stranger, stood like a wall between her and despair. Her eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling, but she couldn't find words. The boy squirmed in her arms, half reaching toward the quiet figure who seemed more solid than the whole town around them. The sheriff's patience snapped. "Jacob Carver, I'll not tell you again. This ain't your affair." Jacob's voice, when it came, was low and unshakable. "It is now." The words struck like a hammer blow, and murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. Some faces lit with hope, others with resentment. The women, mothers themselves, watched with wide, fearful eyes, their hands pressed against their aprons. The men shifted uneasily, some muttering that the law was law, others grudgingly nodding that maybe Carver was right. The sheriff raised his chin, his authority faltering under the weight of Jacob's stillness. "You're gonna put yourself against the court, Carver. Against the town." Jacob's gray eyes locked onto his. "Against wrong." The air crackled with tension, so thick it seemed the ground itself might split. No one dared move, not even the boy clinging to his mother's neck. Finally, with a tight scowl, the sheriff lowered his hand and stuffed the papers back into his coat. "Fine. You take her debts, then. You take all of it." He spat into the dirt at Jacob's boots. "You want her and the brat, they're yours. But don't come crying when you're ruined same as her." It wasn't mercy, it was a punishment, a shoving off of burden onto someone fool enough to claim it. Jacob didn't flinch. "Done." The widow gasped, looking up at him in disbelief. The boy peered curiously at the tall rancher, his thumb falling from his mouth. For the first time in weeks, the widow felt something stir inside her chest that wasn't despair. Hope flickered, fragile but alive. The sheriff turned sharply, barking orders to the men around him to clear the auction. Folks shuffled, whispering to one another about what they had just seen. Some shook their heads, muttering about Carver's foolishness. Others whispered blessings under their breath, thanking heaven someone had stepped in. Jacob bent slightly and extended his hand toward the widow. "Come." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She looked around as if expecting someone to snatch the boy away still. But all she saw was the man standing steady in front of her, his hand waiting, not forcing. With trembling fingers, she reached out and placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, the kind of strength that told her she would not fall if she held on. For the first time in months, she felt anchored. He led her gently down from the platform, his other hand adjusting his hat as if to shield her from the stairs. The boy reached toward Jacob, tiny arms stretching in instinctive trust. The rancher hesitated only a heartbeat before taking the child into his arms. The boy nestled against his broad chest, curling in as if he had known him forever. The widow's breath caught. She had been so afraid, so certain that everything would be taken from her, but now, here was a man who asked for nothing, who claimed nothing for himself, yet who had stood for her when no one else would. They moved through the crowd together, whispers trailing after them. Some voices spoke admiration, others scorn. "Fool thing, talkin' on a widow and her brat. Maybe he's got a heart after all. Or maybe he's lost his senses." Jacob ignored them all. His boots crunched against the dirt as he led her toward his waiting horse. When they reached it, he lifted the boy into the saddle as though he weighed no more than a sack of flour. The child giggled, delighted for the first time that day, clutching at the reins. The widow's lips trembled, tears spilling freely now. "I don't understand," she whispered hoarsely. Why would you do this?" Jacob paused, his hat shadowing his face, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. "Ain't right, what they tried. Sometimes a man's gotta step in. That's all." She shook her head, still overwhelmed, but there was no denying the calm strength in his tone. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't obligation. It was choice. He helped her up onto the horse, steadying her with hands calloused from years of work. She clutched her boy close, her heart pounding with something that felt dangerously close to gratitude so deep it hurt. Jacob mounted behind them, taking the reins in one hand. As they rode out of town, the sun was lowering, turning the dust golden in its rays. Behind them, the murmur of the crowd faded until there was only the steady rhythm of hooves against dirt. Ahead stretched the open prairie, wide and untamed, carrying them away from the shame of the auction block. The widow closed her eyes, pressing her face into her boy's hair. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt that maybe, just maybe, they weren't lost after all. And Jacob Carver, silent as ever, rode steady, carrying them into a future neither could yet see, but one no sheriff or town decree could take away.